So it's a cave that the entrance to the cave actually is the thing that's unusually large. You crawl through a little tunnel that skinny people can fit through and big people might not. And you get into this really, really nice wet cave where the stalagmites and stalactites are still forming. And there's pools of water on the floor where bats come in and drink the water. It's a remarkable thing. Here's something else that's really interesting about Basin and Range and sort of the region in general. Is about 367 million years ago, back when most of Nevada was under the ocean, we were hit by a very large asteroid. So what we're showing here, this is a map. So we see on the right side of the screen is the Nevada, Utah, Arizona border lines. I've shown the town of Alamo and some of the major highways in Basin and Range. Now this was a time when Nevada was on the continental shelf and sort of, well, eastern Nevada was on the continental shelf and western Nevada was still deep ocean. And this asteroid hit right in this general area, right about the break in the continental shelf. And one thing that's interesting for people who know this area, you go up to Alamo, you turn left on Highway 375, you're going out towards Rachel. Rachel will be out in here. Anybody know where this dirt road goes? Right out to about where the asteroid impacted? Anybody? That's Groom Lake in Area 51. So in addition to everything else weird about Area 51, it's in the center of an asteroid impact crater. Now, when this thing hit, this is a picture from a geologic paper. And this is a cross-section through the Earth. And what it shows is that the asteroid hit and bashed into the continental shelf. It fractured a lot of the rocks along the edge and threw out lots of stuff and caused some big tsunamis. And you can think of it like this, where you see it drop a single drip of water into a calm pool and it sends out these rings. Well, these rings were created not by a drop before, but by this asteroid. And then each of the rings is actually a tsunami. So the first tsunami rolled out and pushed out these huge giant boulders. And then the water flowed back in, created another tsunami that rolled out and pushed out smaller boulders. And it actually did this 6 times and created 6 tsunamis, creating this total devastation over vast landscapes here. So what happened is that the land was totally blown apart in the red zone. The orange zone is areas that were, the orange zones were messed up and the yellow zones were pretty well thrashed. And since my advancing is only advancing and not going back, we can't go back, but sorry about that. But at any rate, there's a really, really exciting exposure of this. This now is actually just outside the National Monument. But we see you can drive up and hike up this hill to this cliff. And this cliff is the result of the tsunami. And if you walk along the bottom of the cliff, you can see embedded in the matrix sort of house-sized boulders. And then the next layer up is like car-sized boulders. And then you get a little higher and it's just bowling balls. And you get all the way to the very top and it's coarse gravel. So you see the evidence in this hillside of the 6 tsunamis that rolled across this land. Now there are places inside the National Monument where you can see this, but this exposure is by far the best place to see it. So other geologic resources, lots of volcanism. We see here layers of basalt and ash flow tufts. Other kind of resources, remarkable dark skies. When you look at a map of the dark skies, this area is some of the darkest in the United States. Now, when you're out taking pictures, if you're really lucky, you might just catch a falling star in your image. So what is Basin and Range biologically? Well, it's home for pronghorn, iconic animal of the western US. It's home to pygmy rabbits, these are rabbits that are tiny. We occasionally see baby rabbits hopping around our desert. Well, the baby rabbits we see are as big as the adults of pygmy rabbits get. Little tiny things. And kangaroo mice. Some of us are familiar with kangaroo rats, cute little creatures that hop around on their hind legs with a long tail for balance. Well, up here we have pygmy mice, so even smaller than our cute little pygmy rats. Basin Range is home to lots of mule deer and elk for that matter, badgers, lots of birds, golden eagles, great horned owls, loggerhead shrikes. This is one of our sensitive species in Nevada now. There's lots of them up in Basin Range. It's also home to diverse reptile species, such as this collared lizard or this little rattlesnake. It's home to diverse plant species. I don't have a picture of it, but there's only one species that's in Basin Range Monument. That's the White River cat's eye, a little borage, a little forget-me-not. Some really cool species. This is flat thing that we find down in the valley bottoms. Pretty yellow flowers on it. There's bristlecone pines high up in the mountain ranges. Basin Range, surprisingly, is home to several ranching families. These people have lived here since the late 1800s, and they really started ranching operations in about 1900. And Basin Range is partially set up to protect them, to preserve the legacy of ranching in Nevada. And the people that run these operations now live out there. And some of them actually live just right on the edge of Basin Range National Monument. And I can bet that as we speak, there's little kids crawling around on cabin floors, growing up there on the edge of civilization, with their grandparents who want nothing more than to see them grow up and have the opportunity to carry on the family traditions. Well, now, Michael Heiser's Land Art City. Are people familiar with land art? These are really large-scale art pieces. People are probably familiar with the Spiral Jetty and the Great Salt Lake and some of these other large pieces. Well, Michael Heiser is this world-famous artist that nobody here has ever heard of. But he did most of his work in the 1960s, maybe a little bit earlier. And he pioneered a lot of things, including the notion of negative space. It's one of the things that he's really very well known for. Negative space is a curious concept where you think of Michelangelo, who looked at a piece of marble and said, I can see David inside this piece of marble. And all I have to do to create the sculpture of David is chip all the junk off the outside, and I'll be left with David. Well, Michael Heiser would look at that same piece of marble, and he would say, I can see David inside here. And all I have to do is chip away the stuff inside, and we would have David. So Michael Heiser would sort of go up inside the boulder of marble, hollow out the inside so that it was David, perfect representation of David, and then be finished. And you and I would look at it, and we would say, this is just a stupid piece of marble. And Michael Heiser would say, but think about what's inside it, the negative space. Well, that's kind of a funny example, but this notion of negative space has gone on to inspire a lot of modern art. So we just got finished with 9/11. You know, the 9/11 memorial in New York is a cavern with waterfalls falling into it. Well, that cavern is negative space. It's a big open area where things are falling, where the waterfalls are falling into. Or if you've been on the mall in Washington, D.C. and visited the Vietnam War Memorial, you know that you walk across the lawns and then you go down into a dip. And the names on the wall are basically a retaining wall holding back the berm of dirt. So again, it's that idea of negative space. So back to Michael Heiser's city. Michael Heiser bought some land out here in the middle of Garden Valley in the 1960s. And since about 1970, he's been working on his greatest and grandest sculpture called City. Not the city, simply City. And it's his homage to American architecture that includes South American and North American architecture. Now in this photo, we're looking across almost 2 air miles of desert, and we see City as a collection of ramps, berms, and hills set in a scenery with the backdrop of the vast emptiness and backed by mountain ranges. You really don't see much from a distance. But if you look at it in an aerial view, this is a Google Earth image. So we can see Michael Heiser's City here stretching across the screen. These 2 green patches are 20-acre pastures. And then the other stuff here is his ranch buildings. So if these are each 20 acres, we know that City is big. In fact, it's 1.25 miles long and 1/4 mile wide. And if you were to compare it with the Washington Monument, with the Washington Mall, it's virtually the same size, stretching from the US Capitol all the way to the Washington Monument. Michael Heiser always liked to do really big things. He thought if you're going to make something, you might as well make it big enough for everybody to see. So as his homage to American culture, we see ramps and berms and things. And this is inspired by his early childhood with his father, who was an archaeologist, doing work in the upper Mississippi River Valley with Native American mound building cultures. And then later on, down in Central America with Aztec and other sorts of cultures down there with their ramps and berms. This part of it, which is at the southeast end, is clearly represents elements of the Mayan pyramids. Now it does have some odd things too. This is, I think, the first thing he did out there. And this is just art. Now, I can describe it, but I certainly cannot explain it. But this is, I think this was called framed earth. And what it is, it's a slope. This brown is to represent dirt of the earth. And then around the edges, it's a little bit hard to see. There's these funny shapes. Well, if you stand just in the right perspective, all of these funny shapes line up together, form a border or a frame around his earth, framed earth. Again, don't ask me to understand it. Now this is another one. This is an homage to modern American architecture. These are very finely crafted pieces of concrete, of high-end concrete, very exacting dimensions, and repetitive pieces. And also I'm told that if we were to take the pieces here at the right end and push them all together back, that they would all fit into this framed box back here. It doesn't look like they would, but that's what I've been told. So again, some modern art to go along with his homage to American architecture. So City is artwork set in a landscape that draws contrasts and power from the interplay of the human and natural features. The natural background was very important to Mr. Heiser to draw this distinction. Now, he built this starting in the 70s, and over the years, various organizations have come in and said that they want to do things in other parts of Garden Valley, such as explore for oil, or put in solar fields, or mine underground water, or even put in urban areas. And Michael Heiser was very upset with this, as were his arts world patrons. They said that the background of City is part of the artwork, and that these other things would damage the art. But the developers would just stand back and say, well, you know, it's not on top of City, it's not hurting the artwork at all. But Michael Heiser would say, think of it this way. Here we have an image of Mona Lisa, pretty lady with a quirky smile. Who knows what's the background of Mona Lisa? Is anybody? Well, how about this? It's a landscape. It has natural features, cliffs and mountains and a lake, and has man-made features. There's a winding road, and over on her other shoulder is a bridge across the river. Interesting, it has basins and ranges. And so if we were to take the background and draw a bunch of graffiti on it, we might argue that we've not damaged Mona Lisa at all. She's still standing there with her quirky smile. Haven't damaged at all, just in the background. Well, I'm sure that we would all be highly offended by such. Well, that's the attitude that the arts community took. And so seeing this art piece in jeopardy, which by the way was funded to went to Congress and started trying to talk with Senator Reid at the time and other congressional representatives about getting this site designated as a national monument. They wanted to have Garden Valley protected so that the background for Michael Heiser's artwork would be protected. They worked on it for about 10 years and weren't quite getting it done. But in about 2013, they came to the conservation community and asked us to help. And by 2015, with a lot of work by a lot of people, we did, in fact, get it done. So Basin and Range, what is it? It's a national monument that, first of all, protects Michael Heiser's city, but it also protects tremendous cultural resources, geologic resources, wildlife, vegetation, and the people living there, all while inspiring economic development through ecotourism. So let's move on. So if you were to visit Basin and Range, it is a very wild and remote place, but the roads are pretty well maintained. These are all ranch roads, so there's lots of money to maintain ranch roads. Of course, during the monsoon seasons, it gets muddy, and in this winter, it gets snow. But most of the year, you can drive a sedan through many of these roads. There's quite an extensive road network of major graded roads and lots of minor roads. And for people who might want to visit, there's a nice tour that one can drive, coming in across Coal Valley, through Water Gap over by Michael Heiser City. You can't get in yet, but we can see it from afar. And then continuing through Garden Valley and then looping back out to 318 again. Makes for a nice day trip. Be sure to bring your lunch though. There is one entrance sign, and just in July, they actually put in the new permanent entrance sign, and I've not been up yet to see it, so I'm looking forward to getting some new photographs next time I'm up. As you're driving through, there's a few narrow canyons, but mostly it's lots and lots of wide open spaces. There are a few intersection signs. None of the roads seem to have proper names, but you can get some place names and follow a map and get in and back out again safely. There are no facilities of any kind, but there are lots of places to camp. There's no trails of any kind, but lots of old roads to hike on. And although there's no trails, there are mountains to climb everywhere. And of course, when you get up on top of one of the mountains, you look out and you see so many more, encouraging people to go and find their own hike. There are some interesting points of interest, such as this natural bridge, or a natural arch. There's no water going on here. A lot of people like to come here and do night photography and other interesting things. If you're visiting and you don't want to camp, the Alamo Inn is an older kind of rundown place run by a friend of mine who's one of the few people that actually lives in Alamo and supports the National Monument. So if you get up that way, he's a good one to stay with. There's gas and food and groceries available in Alamo, in case you need more gas. So that's how we visit it. So now the more extra extensional question is why? Why is Basin and Range? So again, it's back to this notion of abstract art, and we have to think carefully about it before we really start to appreciate the place. So by and large, the National Monument focuses on protecting basins. And why basins? Well, through development over the years, basins are the places where we put our roads. It's where the water is. It's where we have our towns, our farms, our stockyards. It's also the place where we put things like poorly regulated landfills or energy developments. You know, we have lots of solar farms going in all over the place. Well, they're all going on in the valleys. We're probably not going to fracking Nevada, but this is where people wanted to explore for oil, is in the valley bottoms. And even for most of us conservationists, what are basins? Basins are the things we drive across to get to the mountains on the other side where we want to recreate. So it's not a whole lot of love for basins, but there's reason to do so. For instance, they protect habitat for these animal species that we talked about. They protect habitat for some of these weird little plants that grow out there. They protect areas for recreation. So even though maybe we want to hike up there to Leviathan Cave, we're going to camp down here in the basin. It's great for all sorts of back road recreation, OHVs and car camping. And even some of the truck races like to run in places like this, as long as they stay on the road, of course. By protecting the basins, we can protect the traditional uses of the legacy of the settler families out there. In Garden Valley, it's largely sheep, and in Coal Valley, it's largely cattle. Although it's been such a dry year that not much ranching activity going on this year. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the future. So another good reason to protect basins is to protect the ecological connectedness of the landscape and the northward movement of species in response to climate change. A good example of that is Joshua trees. We know that Joshua trees are dying out on the south edge of their range. Down in Joshua Tree National Park, they anticipate in 50 years there may not be any Joshua trees left because it'll be too hot and dry. Already on the south edge of the park, it's too hot and dry for Joshua trees to reproduce. The only ones left down there are the ancient ones. But just on the south edge of Basin Range National Monument are the northernmost Joshua trees. And if you drive along the ET Highway, you can look to the north towards Basin Range and see a landscape covered with baby Joshua trees marching up the hillside, and they're marching up to here towards Garden Valley. We can imagine in a century or two more, maybe this will be full of Joshua trees because we've protected the connectedness of the landscape. Another reason to protect basins is because none are represented in the National Lands Conservation System. We actually have a system in this country trying to protect various different kinds of landscapes. And we can think of this, well, yes, and of course we can protect basins because nothing better represents Nevada, our state Nevada. So for instance, Arizona has the Grand Canyon. Their iconic landscape is conserved as Grand Canyon National Park. California has its iconic Joshua trees down there, the big tall lanky Joshua trees. It's conserved in Joshua Tree National Park. And of course, Basin and Range is in Nevada, and it's trying to protect, oh, but wait, there's no basins. So Great Basin National Park has no basins. All it protects is the ranges. It really, I suppose, ought to be called Great Ranges National Park because there are no basins out there. So why do we protect Basin and Range National Monument? Well, largely because of Michael Heiser's city, which got the whole ball rolling, but also tremendous natural resources. It is a landscape that represents the true Nevada, the true Basin Range province that is Nevada. And it adds intact basin ecosystems to our conservation system. But the best reason for protecting it is just because we can. It's a remarkable place. I'd encourage you all to get up and visit it. If you'd like to do so, you can go to my website, shameless plug here for birdandhike.com. And if you click on the Basin and Range button, that will take you to an overview page for it, and a button here for information on visiting Basin and Range. And with that, I say thank you for your interest in Basin and Range, and I hope that you come up and visit it before too terribly long. And we'll turn it back over to Brenda.
Yes, I do have one question in the chat. It is the Big Rocks Wilderness part of Basin and Range National Monument?
No, Big Rock is not. It's just kind of across the highway from us.
Okay.
When they were talking about the actual boundaries of Basin and Range, they talked about including some of the surrounding wilderness areas to make it one big unit, but they decided it was too big, and that if it was too many acres, it would look like too big of a federal land grab, even though it's all federal land. And so they cut out some of the surrounding areas. So for instance, Mount Irish Wilderness Area is literally on the boundary, and it's not included in the National Monument. Any other questions?
Yes, there's one more in the chat before I open it up to verbal questions. Will city be open to the public soon?
You know, that's always the question. City was intended to have been open probably 5 or 8 years ago. Artists don't like to reveal their artwork before it's finished. And with something as big and complex as city, it's hard to ever decide that you're actually finished. But one of the interesting things about that particular question is climate change. Climate change has affected the opening of city. So Michael Heiser works in negative space, which means most of his stuff is below ground level. Well, if you're constructing things below ground level, you have to worry about rain and flash floods and such. And so as an engineer, Michael Heiser's people went and looked at the climate models and said, well, what's the most rain we expect to get out here? And they designed their sump system for a 100-year flood, probably even a little bit more than a 100-year flood. So underneath city are huge cisterns designed to catch all this rainwater so that it doesn't flood the place. Well, lo and behold, the climate is changing. So what we knew as a 100-year flood in the past is not particularly relevant to the current situation. And sure enough, a couple of years ago, there was a huge thunderstorms out there, big flash floods, caused a lot of damage at city and flooded the place. And Michael Heiser actually had to go back in, tear out a bunch of it, put in much larger cisterns, and then rebuild parts of it. So that set back the whole process by a couple of years. But anyway, if you ask, it's always next year. Now, Michael Heiser is an old man and in poor health. And I would expect that with his passing, the foundation that manages it will open it pretty quickly afterwards. But, you know, he's hanging on. We're all glad for that, of course, but the city's not open yet. Next year. Expect it next year.
Good to know. Okay, I don't have any more chat questions. Does anyone have any verbal questions for Jim? Remember to unmute yourself if you do, so we can all hear you.
Yeah, I'm just noticing that, Jim, you're talking about the Leviathan cave area. And then in light of the relative proximity to the Great Basin National Park, with their caves in there, and I'm wondering, is there currently, or has there been any evidence of in the past eons of any sort of an underground connection to those two cave systems, or is that just a coincidence?
Oh, I think that's just a coincidence. They're quite far apart.
Okay.
And although Leviathan Cave is named Leviathan, a thing of unusual size for its kind, it's really only the entrance that's a Leviathan.
Okay.
And actually to get into the cave itself, the wet part is pretty small.
One quick final question here.
There's
You talked about the camping out there. Is this basically like BLM rules, free range camping under those BLM guidelines, or are there some other controls?
I'm sorry, you kind of broke up right at the end of your comment. What about the camping?
Is it basically free range camping using BLM rules, or is there other concerns?
Yes, free range camping. You can camp anywhere you want.
Good.
You know, use an existing place. Leave no trace and those sorts of things.
Got it.
The shepherds have a lot of places out there where they pull their trailers. They have these old kind of funny wagons, reminiscent of the old Wild West kind of wagons almost. They're not canvas covered, but they pull their wagons out, and they have lots of places along the roads where they park their wagons, and those make great places to camp.